What if the man who made millions laugh carried a secret so dark it shaped the rest of his life?
Before the first time he walks in, it's like I've
Robin Williams, the genius who brought joy to countless people, spent over 3 decades haunted by one night. A night when he walked away from a friend who needed him most.
I know the first thing about how hard your life has been, how you feel, who you are.
This isn't just another Hollywood tragedy. This is about what really happened to John Belushi, and why Robin Williams could never forgive himself. The late 1970s were electric in Hollywood. Comedy wasn't just entertainment, it was a revolution. Robin Williams exploded onto screens as the lovable alien Mork in Mork and Mindy.
And then, for those, your loved ones, you basically create a rememory, taking the highlights. There's a computer program that sorts through.
A role that turned him into an overnight sensation. His rapid-fire improvisation and manic energy were unlike anything audiences had seen before. The show was a spin-off from Happy Days, but Williams made it entirely his own. Every episode felt like controlled chaos, with Williams improvising so much that the scripts became mere suggestions. Audiences couldn't get enough. Meanwhile, John Belushi owned Saturday Night Live. His samurai sketches, his Jake Blues character, his ability to transform into anything the sketch required.
Great cinematographers, great directors, great crew in weird places, and for me,
everything he touched turned to gold. Animal House had just made him a movie star, cementing his status as the comedic force of his generation. These two titans of comedy found each other in the chaos. They became friends, bonding over their craft and the intoxicating lifestyle that came with fame. Both were riding high. Both were unstoppable. Both were feeding off the energy of an era that celebrated excess. But there was a difference between them that everyone noticed. Williams was wild, sure. His comedy was manic and unpredictable, but Belushi was on another level entirely. He lived harder, partied longer, pushed every boundary further than anyone thought possible. He took Williams on night tours through New York City's punk rock underground, dragging him to clubs that felt dangerous and thrilling. They'd hit places like CBGB, watching bands that snarled and screamed, surrounded by people who looked like they'd cut you for fun. Williams described it as feeling like Beaver Cleaver in the underworld, completely out of his element but unable to look away. It was like being on a tour with Dante, if Dante were James Brown, he once said. Belushi was the guide to a world Williams never knew existed, and it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Belushi was a beast, fearless and unstoppable, or so it seemed. Behind the laughter and the parties, something sinister was brewing. Hollywood's playground had venomous snakes hiding in the grass, and both men were dancing closer to the edge than anyone realized. The drugs that fueled their creativity were becoming the drugs that controlled them. For Williams, substances were a place to hide, a way to slow down his racing mind that never stopped spinning. Most people get hyper on coke. Williams would admit years down the line, it slowed me down. For Belushi, drugs were fuel for the fire that burned too bright too fast. He couldn't exist at a normal speed. Everything had to be cranked to maximum volume, maximum intensity, maximum danger. His friends started noticing the warning signs. The way he'd disappear for days. The way his speech would slur even when he claimed to be sober. The way his eyes looked hollow even when he was smiling. But what came next would shock everyone. March 1982. John Belushi checked into bungalow number 3 at the Chateau Marmont Hotel in West Hollywood. The chateau had a reputation as a hideaway for celebrities who wanted privacy, a place where the rules were looser and the staff looked the other way. Belushi wasn't there for a vacation. He was supposed to be working, writing a screenplay that would resurrect his career after 2 major disappointments. Continental Divide and Neighbors had bombed badly, both critically and commercially, and Paramount executives were losing patience with their once golden boy. His last real success was Animal House, and that felt like a lifetime ago even though it had only been 4 years. The pressure was crushing him, suffocating him, and instead of rising to meet it, Belushi was sinking deeper into his vices. The bungalow became his prison and his sanctuary, a place where reality couldn't touch him. By early March, people close to Belushi were worried sick. He was missing meetings left and right, showing up disheveled and incoherent when he did appear. His speech was slurred, his attention span non-existent, his appearance increasingly alarming. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The hotel room reflected his internal chaos. Trash and pizza boxes everywhere, wine bottles scattered like casualties of war, dirty laundry piled in corners. And then there was the woman. Kathy Smith, a Canadian singer turned drug dealer, had attached herself to Belushi like a shadow. She'd been with him for days, and her presence made everyone uncomfortable. Smith had a reputation in the music world. She'd been a backup singer for the band, had dated Gordon Lightfoot, and had connections to Keith Richards and other rock stars. But somewhere along the way, she transformed into something darker. She carried drugs in a silver metallic purse, earning her the nickname Kathy Silverbag. When Robert De Niro stopped by the bungalow earlier that evening of March 4th, he was disturbed by what he saw. De Niro had run into Belushi at On the Rocks, an exclusive club on the Sunset Strip. They'd made plans to hang out afterward, but when De Niro arrived, the scene was all wrong. The place was trashed, not just messy but destroyed, like someone had torn through it in a rage. Smith was lounging among the wreckage, acting like she owned the place. De Niro couldn't hide his disgust. He called her trashy in later accounts, and his instincts told him to get out. He told Belushi he'd come back soon, then left as quickly as he could. Hours passed. Past 3 in the morning, De Niro ran into Robin Williams. Williams had just finished an unscheduled set at the Comedy Store. De Niro suggested they stop by Belushi's place. Williams agreed. When Williams walked through that sliding glass door, he entered a scene that would torment him for decades. Smith was still there, and Williams immediately felt uneasy. He described her as tough and scary, someone who radiated danger. Belushi was in bad shape, so intoxicated he could barely stand. Yet somehow, when he picked up his guitar, he played it to perfection. Williams stayed for a few minutes, had some coke, and left. De Niro did the same shortly after. Neither man realized they were among the last people to see John Belushi alive. What happened next would change everything. Robin Williams showed up to the morgue, and Mindy set the next morning with a slight hangover. He had no idea what had happened after he left that bungalow. He went about his work, running lines and preparing for another day of shooting. The show was in its final season, and everyone was going through the motions. Williams was professional as always, making the crew laugh between takes, keeping the energy up even though the scripts weren't what they used to be. Then around lunchtime, everything stopped. Pam Dauber, his co-star and close friend, pulled him aside. Her face was serious, drained of color, her voice shaking. She had terrible news that she didn't know how to deliver gently. "I've got something really terrible to tell you, Robin." He looked at her, confused. "What? What?" And she delivered the blow. "John Belushi was found dead last night." Williams froze. Time seemed to stop. His response was immediate and visceral. "What?" "I was with him last night. I was with him last night." The shock was written all over his face. The man he'd seen just hours ago, alive and playing guitar, was gone. How could that be possible? Williams and Dauber left the set together, walking toward their trailers in stunned silence. Just before Williams went into his trailer, Dauber grabbed him and looked him straight in the eye. "Robin, if that ever happens to you, I will find you and kill you first." It was harsh, but it came from a place of love and terror. She'd seen the lifestyle, knew the risks. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Williams the same way. Williams looked at her with red eyes and made a promise. "That's never going to happen to me, Dobbs. Never." But the guilt was already settling in, heavy and suffocating. He'd been there. He'd seen Belushi in trouble, and he'd walked away. What if he'd stayed? What if he'd refused to leave until Belushi agreed to stop, to get help, to sleep it off? Would Belushi still be alive? The questions had no answers. In those first days following the tragedy, Williams kept quiet publicly. When reporters started digging, Williams gave careful responses. He denied using drugs during his visit, claiming he'd only had a glass of wine. He said Belushi just seemed tired, nothing more. It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth, and Williams knew it. He'd been in that room. He'd done coke. He'd seen the chaos, seen Kathy Smith, seen the state Belushi was in, and chosen to leave anyway. The world wanted answers about what happened to John Belushi, but Williams wasn't ready to give them. The weight was too much to carry in the spotlight, so he carried it in silence instead, letting it eat away at him piece by piece, day by day, year after year. Williams told his wife Valerie about Smith during his visit, describing her as tough and scary, someone who made him uncomfortable. But he had no idea that this woman would be the one to end his friend's life just hours after he left. The truth was about to come out, and it would be more disturbing than anyone imagined. For months, John Belushi's death remained shrouded in mystery. The official cause was listed as an accidental OD of cocaine and heroin, a speedball, but the details were murky. Who gave him the drugs? What really went down in those final hours? Then, in June 1982, the National Enquirer published a bombshell story. Kathy Smith, the woman who'd been with Belushi during his last night, confessed everything. The headline screamed across newsstands, "I killed John Belushi. I didn't mean to, but I am responsible." Smith admitted she'd been paid $15,000 for the interview, and what she revealed was chilling. According to Smith, she'd injected Belushi with speedballs multiple times throughout the night and into the early morning. She described it casually, like it was just another favor for a friend who always wanted more. The timeline she laid out was disturbing. She'd been administering drugs to Belushi for days. On March 2nd, she'd injected both Belushi and comedian Nelson Lyon with cocaine 5 times. On March 4th, she'd done it again, 3 or 4 more times. Then after Robin Williams and Robert De Niro left the bungalow, Smith stayed. She continued feeding Belushi's habit, mixing heroin and cocaine into a lethal cocktail and pushing it into his veins over and over. Around 8 in the morning, room service delivered wheat toast, jam, and a pot of coffee to the bungalow. Smith signed for it, ate her breakfast, and then cleaned up the drug paraphernalia scattered around the room. She was covering her tracks. She checked on Belushi, heard him snoring loudly in bed, and left. She thought he was just sleeping it off. She had no clue she'd just ended his life. Hours passed. Around noon, Belushi's trainer and bodyguard, Bill Wallace, arrived for their scheduled workout. He knocked, got no answer, let himself in, and found Belushi unresponsive in bed. Wallace tried to wake him, shook him, yelled his name. Nothing worked. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. John Belushi was dead at 33 years old. Robert De Niro had been trying to reach Belushi all morning, calling over and over with no answer. When he finally got through to the hotel and demanded to speak to the manager, asking where John was, he learned the devastating truth. De Niro reportedly dropped the phone and cried. The news spread like wildfire through Hollywood. One of comedy's brightest stars had burned out in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. Smith's confession led to her arrest. She was indicted on 1 count of second-degree murder and 13 counts of administering dangerous drugs. Eventually, she took a plea deal, pleading no contest to involuntary manslaughter and 3 drug charges. She served 15 months in the California Institution for Women before being deported back to Canada. For the rest of her life, she was haunted by what she'd done. Friends said she carried the burden constantly, believing that if she'd stayed with Belushi that morning instead of leaving, things might have been different. She died in 2020 at 73, never fully escaping the shadow of March 5, 1982. The judge who sentenced her called the drugs she provided poison, and said Belushi's own recklessness didn't absolve her of responsibility. But there was more to this story than anyone knew. John Belushi's death hit Robin Williams like a freight train. Here's a guy who's a beast, who could do anything, and he's gone, Williams confessed. That sobered the hell out of me. It wasn't just grief, it was terror. Williams realized he was on the same path, heading toward the same cliff. He had a choice to make, and he had to make it fast. His wife Valerie was pregnant with their son, Zach. Williams knew he couldn't be a father while living that lifestyle. He couldn't raise a child while hiding bottles and doing lines in bathrooms. So he stopped cold. He quit cocaine and alcohol and didn't touch either for nearly 20 years. Belushi's passing triggered what many in Hollywood called a big exodus from drugs. The party scene that had seemed so glamorous suddenly looked deadly. People saw what went down with Belushi and thought, that could be me. Williams wasn't alone in his sobriety, but he was one of the most vocal about why he'd made the change. Cocaine for me was a place to hide, he admitted years afterward. Most people get hyper on coke. It slowed me down. It gave him an escape from the relentless speed of his own mind, but that escape had nearly cost him everything. Watching Belushi's life end made Williams realize hiding wasn't worth the price. Pam Dauber's warning echoed in his mind constantly. If that ever happens to you, I will find you and kill you first. She'd meant it, and Williams knew it. He'd promised her it would never happen, and for 2 decades, he kept that promise. He threw himself into his career, channeling his energy into roles that would define a generation. Mrs. Doubtfire, Dead Poets Society, Good Will Hunting, the list goes on. He became not just a comedian, but a beloved actor, someone who could make you laugh until you cried and then make you cry for real. But beneath the surface, the remorse never left. He'd been there during those final hours. He'd seen Belushi in trouble, and he'd walked away. No amount of success could erase that fact. No number of awards could silence the voice in his head asking, what if you'd stayed? What if you'd done something? The questions had no answers, and that made them unbearable. Williams told People magazine in 1988 that the Belushi tragedy was frightening. His passing scared a whole group of show business people. It caused a big exodus from drugs. And for me, there was the baby coming. I knew I couldn't be a father and live that sort of life. After Mork and Mindy was canceled, Williams and Valerie moved away from the Los Angeles party scene to Northern California. They needed distance from the chaos, from the temptation, from the memories of March 5th. Williams was determined to be a good father. A present father, the kind of father you can't be while chasing the dragon. His sobriety became his identity, proof that he'd learned from what happened, proof that he was stronger than the habit that took his friend. But the pain Williams carried would drive him to do something extraordinary for another friend years down the line. Robin Williams never forgot that he was one of the last people to see John Belushi alive. That knowledge became a weight he carried everywhere, invisible but crushing. Friends and colleagues noticed that Williams had a deep need to help people, to be there for others in their darkest moments. Some believe this compulsion was born from the remorse of not saving Belushi. If he couldn't help his friend during those final hours, maybe he could help someone else before it was too late. One of the most striking examples came in 1995 when Christopher Reeve, the Superman actor, was paralyzed in a horseback riding accident. Reeve's life changed in an instant. He was riding his horse Eastern Express in competition when the horse backed off from a jump. Reeve kept moving forward. His head hit the rail fence and he landed on the turf on his forehead. The New York Times reported that his head dangled, just barely connected to his spine. The fall caused multiple fractures of the first and second cervical vertebrae, leaving Reeve unable to move his limbs or breathe without a respirator. The despair was overwhelming. Robin Williams was one of the first people to visit him in the hospital, and what he did was extraordinary. He dressed up as a German doctor with a thick accent and insisted that Reeve needed a proctology exam immediately. Reeve was confused at first, unable to figure out who this absurd doctor was demanding he turn over for an exam. Then it clicked. It was Robin. His best friend had come to make him laugh when laughter seemed impossible. That moment gave Reeve hope when he had none. Williams' refusal to let his friend sink into despair became a lifeline. Many believe Williams felt he owed it to Reeve because he hadn't been able to save Belushi. Rob Shooter, a National Enquirer columnist, explained that Robin felt partially responsible for not having done enough to save his friend John Belushi. So when he entered the hospital room for Christopher Reeve, he made sure to show up in the most Robin Williams way possible. He couldn't change the past, but he could change someone's present. He couldn't bring Belushi back, but he could keep Reeve from giving up. That drive to rescue others became part of who Williams was. A permanent scar from March 5, 1982. Williams carried this burden quietly for decades, rarely speaking about it publicly, but never letting it go privately. It informed everything he did, every friendship he maintained, every person he tried to help. The question of what if haunted him endlessly. What if he'd stayed longer? What if he'd recognized how bad things really were? What if he'd called for help? These questions had no answers, only the cold reality that John Belushi was gone, and nothing could change that. But Williams' own demons were waiting in the shadows, patient and persistent. For 20 years, Robin Williams stayed clean. He kept his promise to Pam Dauber, to his family, to himself. But in 2005, while filming The Big White in Alaska, something cracked. The pressure, the loneliness, the exhaustion, it all came rushing back. Williams found himself on an airplane, staring at one of those tiny bottles of Jack Daniels they give you in first class. Just one, he thought. Just this once. He drank it. Then a week later, he was hiding a big bottle of Jack Daniels. The descent was swift and brutal. What had taken years to build crumbled in days. By 2006, Williams checked into rehab. He got clean again, fought his way back. But the demons were waiting. In 2014, Williams checked into rehab again. This time at the Hazelden Foundation in Minnesota. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but nobody could figure out what. He was sober, but he was falling apart anyway. His wife Susan noticed terrifying changes. He was anxious all the time, paranoid about things that made no sense. He struggled to remember lines on set. During the filming of Night at the Museum 3 in the spring of 2014, he had a panic attack and couldn't remember even one line in his role as Teddy Roosevelt. This was a man who'd memorized hundreds of lines without error while performing on Broadway just 3 years before. His movements were stiff, his face frozen in a Parkinsonian mask. He had gut discomfort that made him fearful and anxious. Doctors diagnosed him with Parkinson's disease and told him he had at least 10 good years ahead. Williams didn't believe them. He asked if it was Alzheimer's or schizophrenia. Something inside him knew this wasn't just Parkinson's, but nobody had the answers. He kept saying, "I just want to reboot my brain." Nothing worked. On August 11, 2014, Robin Williams took his own life at his home in Paradise Cay, California. He was 63 years old. The world was stunned, heartbroken, furious. How could someone who brought so much joy be in so much pain? 3 months afterward, the autopsy revealed the truth. Williams had diffuse Lewy body dementia, one of the worst cases doctors had ever seen. His brain was riddled with Lewy bodies, abnormal protein deposits that destroyed neurons and neurotransmitters. Susan Williams called it the terrorist inside my husband's brain. Every part of his brain was affected. No area was left untouched. One neuropathologist said it was as if he had cancer throughout every organ of his body. He had about 40% loss of dopamine neurons, and almost no neurons were free of Lewy bodies throughout the entire brain and brainstem. The disease caused the paranoia, the memory loss, the anxiety, all of it. Williams wasn't losing his mind because of weakness. His brain was literally disintegrating, and he was aware enough to feel it happening. Robin was losing his mind, and he was aware of it. Susan wrote in a journal article, "Can you imagine the pain he felt as he experienced himself disintegrating? Even if they'd known the truth while he was alive, there was no cure. The terrorist was going to win." The parallels to March 1982 were impossible to ignore. Robin Williams and John Belushi, two names forever linked by comedy, by tragedy, by a single night in 1982 that changed everything. Williams spent over 3 decades carrying the burden of walking away from his friend. He transformed that remorse into sobriety, into helping others, into a legacy that touched millions. But in the end, the darkness caught up with him anyway. Not through drugs or alcohol, but through a disease that stole his mind piece by piece. The revelation Williams made about Belushi wasn't just about what went down during those final hours at the Chateau Marmont. It was about recognizing his own mortality, about understanding that even beasts can fall. Here's a guy who's a beast, who could do anything, and he's gone. Williams said those words about Belushi, but they became true about him too. Did the remorse over Belushi contribute to Williams' struggles decades afterward? We'll never know for certain, but we do know that Williams never forgave himself for leaving that bungalow. We know he spent his life trying to save others because he couldn't save John, and we know that when his own brain turned against him, there was no one who could save him either. Both men wanted the same thing in the end, to stop the pain, to silence the noise, to find peace. Williams' final wish, according to his widow, was simple. "I want to help people be less afraid." Maybe by understanding what really went down with John Belushi and how it shaped Robin Williams' life, we can honor that wish. Maybe by talking about the darkness these brilliant men faced, we can make others feel less alone in their own struggles. Because that's what Robin would have wanted. Not silence, not shame, but honesty. The kind of honesty it took him 30 years to find, and a lifetime to accept. 2 comedy legends, 2 heartbreaking endings, 1 night that connected them forever.